Okay.
हर्ष तनखा जी, आप स्टार्ट कर सकते हैं सर। अनम्यूट करें हर्ष तनखा जी।
अनम्यूट कर लीजिएगा तनखा सर।
हर्ष तनखा जी अपने आप को अनम्यूट कर लें।
प्लीज अनम्यूट।
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Start, please.
So this is Mr. Wagmare's question. He was asking to say something about mutation of brain cells. So before I begin, I want to say something, because we've been talking about mind and consciousness and brain and awareness and so on. But this is an area where words are not very clear. So we have to be careful not to get caught up in meanings of words. Today I'm going to use the word insight, because when talking about mutation of brain cells, Krishnaji uses the word insight. So but just to give you an example, this might mean different things to different people. I mean, take love, for example. Love means, people have written books about this. Love can mean the love of a mother for her child, which is usually uncritical and can be in one direction only. The mother loves the child deeply, but the child doesn't reciprocate. Then there's the love between two friends, which is a different kind of love. They're often critical of each other. It's not uncritical like mother-child love. Then there is the love between a man and a woman, which has sexual overtones. And then, there's less personal forms of love, like love of country, and the love of ideas like freedom and democracy. And also there is what some people call universal love, which is love without an object, just love, not loving something, but just love. And people say that there are some gurus and even Krishnaji, that when they come into a room, you can feel them radiating love. So all these things have very subtly different meanings, and yet in some ways, they're all similar as well. So just like love, so rather than look at all the ways in which insight can be talked about differently, let us just try and understand how the word insight is being used in this context. So when Vagmaraji said something about mutation of brain cells, we have to become clear what the question is over here. We must investigate the question. And not just what the question is, but why are we asking this question? What is our purpose in it? And also what we hope to achieve, what do we want to get out of this thing? And I have to think, what kind of response should I give? So, if you asked a neurosurgeon about mutation of brain cells, he would probably tell you, oh yes, the cells can mutate. And when they mutate, they become cancerous and form a tumor and a brain tumor. And I can operate and remove the brain tumor, and that will make your brain function better. So that's one way in which the cells mutate, and obviously not what we are so interested in. Or you could have a psychiatrist, and he says, oh yes, you're depressed, or you have anxiety, and I will give you an antidepressant, or I will give you a tranquilizer, and you take these pills, and your brain, you will be in a better frame of mind. Your brain will improve, right? Now this is, so scientists will talk about the possibility of changing the state of mind, the state of brain, by the use of certain drugs. So, but this is not, again, I think we are asking this question because this is a Krishnamurti group. And the question probably arises from the discussions that Krishnamurti had with scientists. I think in the 1980s, he spoke with David Bohm and David Schoenberg, who was a psychiatrist, and with Carl Pribram, who was a brain scientist, and Fritjof Capra, and various other scientists he was talking to at the time. Particularly David Bohm. He had extensive discussions with David Bohm. So, and it was when he was talking to them that this question arose. And why this question arises is because they start by talking about, has humanity taken a wrong turn? Has humanity, in its development, gone in the wrong way? Because we see that human beings don't work well with each other. There are always wars. Outwardly, there are always wars and conflicts of one kind or another. And inwardly, there is psychological conflict. So why has the human mind, brain, taken this path? Why did it not take the path, which it's also capable of cooperation and of love and of caring, instead of this fighting and conflict? So I think a lot of discussion went on at the time about can we change this? But firstly, they wondered what was the cause of this. And they were talking about how we may be trying to always think of becoming better, of becoming better, both outwardly, improve our circumstances, improve the way we live, and, have a better house or better place or better hunting or better farming, and inwardly, that we are not inwardly depressed or in sorrow or in fear and all those things. And how can we move away from that inwardly? So we are actually constantly looking to better ourselves, both outwardly and inwardly, right? And also they were saying that somehow the human brain long ago came up with the idea of the self, of me. And this has a functional and practical importance, right? Because we need, there are times when I need to say, I'm doing this, I'm not doing this, I live here, I have to go tomorrow to meet so-and-so. So this idea of the self, of me, and of the another person, that is, and that division between me and the other, that has a functional and a practical purpose. But has this become too important? Has the brain somehow taken over and pushed this to the point where it overwhelms us completely and has become too important? So this is what questions they were asking. And so if this is the case, can we change? Can the way our brain functions, in division, in conflict, in the great importance that we give to the self, that is what the kind of change they were talking about. Can we change? And when they talked about it, they said, well, if for this kind of change to take place, the brain And the way the brain functions has to change. There actually has to be a physical change in the brain. You can't have everything in the brain working exactly as it always has, and all of a sudden we become capable of great love and friendship and stop fighting and stop worrying and all that. No, that's the way the brain is set up at the moment. Can the way the brain is, particularly the brain cells, and that will mean change even at the level of the brain cells. Can the brain cells change? Can the way they operate change? So this was how the question of the mutation, this is the background to the question of the mutation of the brain cells, that we are interested to see whether the human brain can change. And this is actually part of the main challenge that Krishnaji puts to us, which is of the transformation of the consciousness of mankind. He himself has stated that that's what he was trying to do, to bring about this transformation. So when we talk about the mutation of the brain cells, we are talking about this transformation in human consciousness. That is, before going into that, let's just take a look at how the brain cells actually work, right? So the brain cells are, I don't know if, I'm not an expert, but I'll say a little bit. So the brain is composed entirely of brain cells. There are generally two kinds of brain cells. One kind is the one that actually is active, and mostly the brain is that. The one that passes, brain cells that pass messages from each one to the other, and they connect with another. And when we talk about a thought process, we are talking about how one brain cell communicates with the next brain cell and so on. And each brain cell looks a little bit like an octopus. It has lots of arms, a single cell, lots of arms that come out, and they also branch like tree branches. So it's not just one arm, but it breaks up into branches. And the end of each of these things connects with another brain cell. So each brain cell is connected with many other brain cells. And so there is this massive, very highly intricate, interconnected network of brain cells, which comprises our brain. And messages pass along. They go along the arms, and the arms can be very long. They're called axons, these long arms that come out from the center of the brain cell. They can be very long. In fact, the biggest brain cells are the ones where the center of the brain cell is in the spine, and it's the brain cell that controls the foot muscles. So this long axon, which is still part of the same cell, goes all the way down the leg and goes right down to the bottom of the feet. So it's like one brain cell can be over a meter long. So and then communication passes along this long axon, and so the brain cell affects the muscles, and the muscles contract, etc. So that's a brain cell. And the brain cells work, they're electrochemical. That is to say, within the brain cell, along the axon, messages pass electrically. But between brain cells, from the end of the axon to the receptor on another brain cell, it's chemicals that pass from one to the other. And there are several chemicals. They're called neurotransmitters. So because they transmit along the nerves, so they are basically, they pass messages on from one brain cell to the next. Now we have 80 to 90 billion brain cells in our brain. The brain, spinal cord, nervous system, they're all one thing actually. So that means that there are, if you think that the population of the earth is about 7 billion, then there are more than 10 times as many brain cells in our brain than there are people on this earth. So this is a very highly intricate structure, a network of interconnections in our brain. And when we talk about being conditioned, some pathways, some paths from one brain cell to the next, 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 they, and then finally to the muscles which will contract and make our actions. These are called neural pathways. And if we use something the same, if we make the same action many times, then that pathway becomes strengthened. The more we use a certain connection between the thing, that connection begins to become very strong. And so the next time we have to perform that action, the brain likes to take that pathway. So this is how conditioning happens. We repeat something several times, then the next time the action comes like that, we are already ready to do it in the same way that we have done it before, because that pathway in the brain has become strengthened. So this is what conditioning consists of strong, broad, like you can think of it as a highway that passes through the brain, through the network of the brain, and makes us take certain actions more easily than other actions. So that now, this is the conditioning in the brain. So when we are talking about becoming free of our conditioning, we are talking about changing the pathways. That's the interconnections that are taking place between the cells in the brain. Also, we can be talking of the chemical side of things, because there are these chemicals, they have names like dopamine and serotonin, acetylcholine, you might have heard of. And they are the ones that actually pass from the tip of one axon to the body of the next. It's a chemical. Between the gap between them, called the synapse, the chemical passes. So that's the chemical side of things. Why am I talking about this? Because there are many people who feel that a change to the brain, the functioning of the brain, can be brought about by adjusting these chemicals. That is to say, a chemical way of bringing about a change in the brain cells. And this, of course, has been known for centuries. And quite more recently, of course, there was the growth of LSD, which functions in this way in the brain, and it changes the functioning of the brain. And people say that if you take LSD, you have this sense. You have the sense, firstly, of love. That is, also you see things as a whole. You see things very sharply. You become very aware. Your awareness increases to a huge extent. And that you are now. And so in the 60s, there was the famous kind of psychedelic revolution when people took a lot of LSD and other drugs which had these psychological effects, and they thought that the taking of these drugs would bring about clarity and love, and there were huge gatherings, and people still talk about how they felt intense love because they had been taking those drugs. But of course, so this is, and not only that, these drugs, especially in South America, Central America, Mexico, and places like that, but in other parts of the world as well, these drugs were used for religious purposes, because people took them And there was usually a witch doctor or shaman or somebody like that who would administer you the drug. And then you would have visions and you would see God and be in touch with God, and you would understand the whole picture of the relationship of nature with human beings and between human beings and all of that. And it was a kind of ritual that people in South America, particularly, and in Central America and Mexico, they used different plants, they used mescaline, and they used mushrooms, they used different things to bring about this change in the brain cells. But of course, it soon faded. I mean, after you'd had that. And so you were left with the memory of an experience of having seen the world and how it functions with great clarity. But then the brain returned to its normal state. And yes, it had the effect of even deconditioning people losing some of their conditioning as a consequence of this. Now, people became very afraid and all these drugs became illegal, but recently they have started to do research and they have allowed scientists to experiment with these drugs again. And they are finding, there's lightning and thunder over here that you may hear, and they're finding that they can use them for precisely that. People who have post-traumatic stress disorder, where they continually relive memories of bad, serious traumatic things like murders and so on, or attacks that have happened to them. So those memories can be, the strength, the power of those memories can be reduced by taking these drugs, which is so that they're no longer troubled by these memories. So a lot of research is taking place today in the chemical effects on brain cells, of which in some ways are parallel what we are talking about. The possibility of reducing conflict, of worry, of fear, increasing the feelings of love and so on. So people are looking for pills today to bring that about. But this is not what obviously Krishnaji was talking about. So basically he was talking about whether the brain can be free of conflict, of free from the self, from the past. We know, I think most of us are aware of the kind of things that he is talking about. But the interesting thing that they were saying in discussion with the scientists was, obviously, if you want to bring about this kind of change, then the brain itself must physically change. You can't keep the brain exactly the same as it was before physically, exactly the same processes inside it, chemical processes, electrical processes, which are thought, and then say that it will function differently. So you actually have to make a physical change in the brain. That has to come about somehow. So they asked this question, which I think was the main question they were asking. They were asking this question: Can insight bring about a mutation of the brain cells? And I think Krishnaji was fairly clear that insight can bring about the mutation of the brain cells. Now, what they mean by insight, we should explore a little bit here. What is this kind of insight that we are talking about? So I think from what I understand, this is my understanding of what was being talked about. And incidentally, I'm reporting all of this in the first person because during that period of time, I happened to be present at every single one of these discussions, including with the brain scientists, including with David Bohm, including because either I was a participant or I was doing the recording. So I haven't read any of this. I'm saying this from what I absorbed as part of these discussions. So they were saying that the kind of change that Krishnamurti was talking about comes about by perceiving the whole functioning of the brain and of thought, which is thought, really. To be able to, not just part of it, nothing partial, and that we have an insight into it. By an insight, they meant that it was like a flash. That in a flash you saw the whole movement of thought, not bit by bit, but in a flash. So this was insight, this all at once seeing the whole movement of thought. And simply the mere act of seeing this whole movement of thought would change the brain, the way the brain works. So very naturally, the question about the mutation of the brain cells becomes the question of what kind of insight is it? What is the nature of this insight that will bring about this change in the functioning of the brain cells? So there are certain things that I have understood, which I will say, this is from my understanding of what they were saying. Firstly, that we know a little bit about insight because we have insights. When suddenly we see something, often great artists have an insight where they see the nature of things. Shakespeare, I mean, they didn't talk about Shakespeare, but I'm saying that Shakespeare obviously had great insight into human beings and how they are and how they behave and their motivations and desires, and his plays are world famous because they show this, that he understood very deeply how people think, feel, what motivates them, what does that. So he had a really deep insight into human nature and human beings. But Krishnaji felt that even that kind of insight, there's also scientific insight. You have people like Newton and Einstein who have an insight into the way the world works. In a flash, they suddenly see that this is what lies behind, this is the pattern, the laws that nature follows. So there is scientific insight. But these, he felt they're important, but they're partial insights. They are insight into a part of our reality. But the kind of insight that he's talking about is a total insight. And he called it that. He called it a total insight. So I thought that I might illustrate this with an example. Now, this is not one that they talked about. This is an example that I'm giving. You must all know the story of the 7 blind men who come across an elephant. Now, one of them says, oh, it's like a tree trunk, because he's touching, feeling around, and he feels the legs. Another one feels its trunk and says, oh, it's like a snake. And another one says it's like a wall because he touches the side. Another one thinks it's like a rope because he's got the tail, and so on. So they have very different views, and they argue amongst themselves about what is this thing? No, it's a snake. No, it's like a tree, and so on. And this is a kind of mystical story that is told to show how each of us has a very limited point of view of or limited understanding of the world around us. And that is why we differ, and that is why we can be in conflict. Now, I had recently met a Sufi scholar who says the Sufi version of this is different. The Sufi version of this is that there's a large, dark hall, and the elephant is in this hall. And these are not 7 blind people, but there are 7 people in a dark room. And they say the same thing. They walk around, and one of them says it's like a tree or a snake or whatever. And then suddenly, somebody turns on the light. And when the light is turned on, they see the whole thing. They see what it is. Not only do they see the whole thing, but they also see that why it is that one of them thought it was a tree trunk and the other one thought it was a snake. And so their differences evaporate. They are no longer arguing about what it is, though each of them can see how they had a partial understanding and how these partial understandings were in conflict with each other. But it was this sudden flash in the darkened room, the light was turned on. And so this is the kind of way that I think Krishnamurti is talking about insight. That it's like somebody turned on and a flash illuminated the whole thing, and then you saw what it was like. Now, so several people asked him, of course, so what happens if the light gets turned off now? Is it just that now we know what it is, and though we can't still see the whole of it, we are still only seeing the foot, or we're only touching the trunk or whatever, but at least we know that these are not at odds with each other. We understand, and so we are no longer in conflict. So, but he says, no, it's not like that. Because he said a very difficult to understand thing. Because he says you're thinking in terms of your ordinary experience through thought of things which are in time. And this idea of a flash sounds like, in time. At some moment, somebody turned on, you suddenly had an insight, and from that moment onwards, so it sounds as if insight takes place. This total insight takes place in time. But he's saying, no, this is not something that takes place in time. It's just that our thinking is limited, so we tend to think of things in terms of time. So we are putting it in terms of time, but it's not in time. It's outside time. And he has to, also he says this is not, and because we're used to thinking of the processes in the brain and how our thoughts are the result of a process in the brain, we might begin to think of insight as also a process in the brain. And several scientists wanted to say that this is something that is part, okay, it's not the ordinary process of the brain, but it's some deep process of the brain, something that we have yet still don't understand, but it's within the brain. Once again, he felt that that was not the case. It is not something, this insight is not coming from within the brain. And it's not part of the brain because the part cannot see the whole. That is essentially what he's saying. It's this thing, this kind of total insight is not something that is of the brain. It's not a material process. And because it's not something in the brain, it's independent of thought. So what does this mean for us? It means that to have this insight, we cannot reach this insight with a process. We sit down or meditate, or okay, it may quiet the brain, we may be able to have some kind of insight, but what he's talking about is not the result in time of a process. So you can't through an effort achieve this insight. The other important thing he said, and of course this is, as you can imagine, the scientists had a lot to say about this, that it is non-material. It's not a material process, it's a non-material action, this insight. So it's very difficult for us to even imagine, with limited brains and limited thinking, what a non-material process is. But it's not a material process, and therefore it's not in time. It just does not happen in time. And as they talk further about it, they said this insight is not in the field of cause and effect. It's not everything that we generally deal with. You do something, something else happens. There is a cause and effect relationship, but there is no cause for this insight. It's not, and therefore you can't try and quote it. You can't invite it. You can't, there's nothing you can do. There is absolutely no effort, no process, no rituals, no will bring about this insight. And yet, he says that this is the total insight that will bring about the change in the way that the brain is. And they talk about all kinds of things. I mean, there's a lot that was happening there. They talked about love and hate. They said, why did human beings, the mind is capable of love, is capable of hate. Why did it move towards hate? Why not towards love? That is what the wrong turn they talked about. The mind has taken a wrong turn. It could have taken the turning that led towards love. Instead, it's taken the turning towards hate, towards conflict, division, and all of those things. So now, so what are we to do? This is another question that was, because now we are left with questions. It's almost as if there is nothing you can do to bring this change about. And so some people thought that, okay, well then we should do nothing. We should not try and bring this change about. But that too, no matter how hard we try, we can't stop ourselves from wanting more, from wanting things to be different, from wanting to be free of sorrow, from looking to see how we can reach the end of fear. So this is a, sorry, I had a phone call interrupted. This is, so can you actually do nothing about it? Or you find yourself always trying to do something about things, improve your situation, to change things for the better, all of which are actions of the thought of brain. And maybe they'll make some things better, but it may not make things better. And it's very limited. At best, it's a partial change. So can we actually do nothing about this? So I think the point that I come to as a result of all that is some other questions that they were asking. It's only questions. There are no answers over here. There are only questions. And the question is, because Krishnamurti was saying that we'll only change if we feel that it is imperative to change, that we must change. Not just individually, but the whole of humanity must change. And that is, and if we look at ourselves, we may get too comfortable. We may say, I'm okay. We may think it's hopeless. We may think it's useless. But if we don't have a driving urge, it's because we don't see that this kind of change, the change that is not in time, that's the only thing that will bring about this transformation in human consciousness. And that is for each of us to ask, am I committed to this? Do I think this so important, or do I just say, look, that's enough. I'm sort of okay now with my life, or I've tried to do what I could, I've tried to do it. And we are not deeply, completely committed to this transformation, which is not of time. And maybe we are just baffled, maybe we just don't know. But until we see the absolute necessity of this change, we won't have the energy to do anything about it. So this is the question of the mutation of brain cells. Do we really want to bring about this mutation?
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, Harshad, Parekh, sir. Wagmare, after this, let everybody finish, then you ask the question. Harshad,
Okay.
Parekh. Harshad,
Yeah.
Parekh.
Okay. Are you able to hear my voice?
Yes.
Yeah, comfortably.
Yes. Okay. Yes, very interesting, Harsh. What you said is very interesting. And today morning also, I had gone through one dialogue between Krishnaji and David Bohm about this insight and mutation of the brain cells. And they went on like that discussing, but at the end of the dialogue, Krishnaji said that he was like that from very
Yes,
childhood.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yes. And some kind of manifestations happens in some human being. They are quite different. And but what about us? So I would like to tell you about my experience, um, about what happened to me after I came to the first book of Krishnamurti, which I read. That was in 1972 at Iowa State. And it was just, I was passing by the bookshop and I saw the book the flight of the eagle, and there was a photograph of Krishna ji. I did not know who was Krishnamurti. I did not know whether he was alive or dead, but I was curious, so I bought that book. And when I started reading, I felt that he was talking to me personally, and he was asking questions like why we are like this, why we are conditioned by our religion, by our nationality, why we are afraid, why we are lonely. And that was probably going on in my life at that time. So I became aware that, yeah, I am like that. Why, why do I think of myself as Indian or Hindu? And the more interesting thing he was saying is that all our psychological problems like fear, anger, jealousy, it comes from thinking. And from thinking comes the sense of I or me. And once this I or me comes, then it says I like it, I don't like. There is a kind of conflict between the thinker and thought, this duality. And Krishnaji was saying that this duality is the source of all our psychological problems. So this was something very new to me. I had not come across. And I asked myself, this me, is it coming from thinking? If it is so, then I must really be very, very attentive and look at the beginning of a thought. Is it possible? So at that time, I was doing my PhD and I had an office and it was very quiet. I, I was sitting in my office and very, very curious, attentive. And when I was in such a state to pick up the beginning of a thought, there was nothing coming. And that was a very kind of a strange feeling I got. And in that, it was something very wonderful that there is no thinking, there are no problems, only the senses are operating. So once I experienced, I said, yes, Krishnaji is quite correct that the source of all our psychological problem is thinking. And so every time I would sit like that to catch the beginning of a thought and nothing coming. And then it became very interesting and that began to change things within my body. My body became very sensitive and even the brain became very sensitive. I could feel the pulses in the brain, just like we have the pulses in the heart, and many other experiences I went through, and it was all very new to me, and so I did not know what all this was. So I was writing letters to Krishna ji about this, and the first letter which I wrote, in that I wrote to Krishna ji that I have been reading books by Ramakrishna, Vivekanand for many years. But after reading your book, I can see how far a human being can go in this dimension of understanding oneself and really being free. Because here in Krishnamurti, it's not the experiences are important. Experiences come and go, but to be in the state of watching whatever is unfolding within the mind. And in that, there are experiences come and go. So there is no attachment here in Krishnamurti's teaching. Only there is also, I feel that there is nothing to understand. All this thing, I never also took any drugs. I was I was fully into just observing myself very intensely. And the changes started happening. So that changes, and when the brain changes, changes in the eyes also started happening, and my way of looking at objects, everything also changed. And for the first time, I felt that yes, one can look really without thinking. And everything looks so beautiful, very clear, and very vivid, and kind of freshness. So this went on for many years. And then after 4 or 5 years reading these books and meditating, looking at it, then I went to Ojai to listen to Krishnaji. And what he was saying was not new to me because I had really looked at what he was saying. But even at that time, after listening to Krishnamurti, I used to feel a bit exhausted. So I felt that it was not a real listening because in real listening, there is no effort and it you catch the essence without any effort. And that thing happened not in 1977, first time I went to Ojai. 1978 also that did not happen. But in 1979, while listening to Krishnaji, I listened perfect silence and I could hear the sounds coming from far. And then I wrote some letters spontaneously. I felt that I could dedicate my life to Krishnamurti schools. And then few days after that, there was a music program and Lakshmi Shankar had come. And during that music program, I felt something happening in the presence of Krishnaji to my whole body, my brain, my heart, everything. And it was some kind of a communion, non-verbal communion. And then when I came out after that, I felt that something new has happened. And then I went back to Canada and it became very clear that my life is for Krishnamurti schools. And then I wrote to him, he wrote me back. I met him in England, Brookwood Park, when you were there also. And then I went to Rishi Valley, and then we had many dialogues with Krishnaji in Rishi Valley with groups, individually also. But what I am saying is that we try to understand a lot Krishnamurti teachings through words, through thinking, but the real learning is not through thinking, not thinking on what Krishnamurti has said, but looking directly at our own mind, and that itself requires the freedom to look. Because if we are not very, very attentive, curious, we cannot look. And so many thoughts comes and then it can lead to anger, fear, jealousy. So here, a effortless awareness of what is happening within our own mind. And then we can really find some treasure within us. We don't need anything, no entertainment requirement required. And just doing nothing also becomes interesting. Generally, what happens, we are trying to escape from our own mind by in watching something or talking with somebody or reading something and thinking about it. But the real learning happens in silent looking, listening, maybe going to walking in the nature or listening to some very good music and a healthy way of living. And then eating proper food, not eating meat and all that thing, proper sleep, exercise, and also positive thinking. I am not against positive thinking. We can create beautiful things within ourselves by the power of positive thinking. And if we can remain in silence, that is the best. But if we cannot remain in silence, we can watch, we can create something. And this helps in our life, makes our life very happy, healthy, creative. So this is what I have learned. And after this thing started happening in my brain and body, I became interested in Pandit Gopi Krishna, who has written many books on Kundalini. And I had correspondence with him. Then I met him in Delhi, and he had met Krishnaji. They both had talked with each other. And then I talked with Krishnaji about Gopi Krishna. And Krishnaji asked me, "What do you think about Gopi Krishna?" I said, "He seems to be a very genuine person, and he writes beautifully, and he has his direct experiences for many years, and many powers also he had, like writing poems in languages which he did not know, and they were just coming. And the whole book about the shape of events to come, he wrote. And he said he did not write, he just wrote down what was coming. So he had some direct insight into the whole human consciousness uh, around us. But so I told Krishnaji that yes, Gopi Krishna seems genuine to me. Then Krishnaji said, yes, Gopi Krishna has gone through many experiences, but he is making too much out of it, some theory and all that out of it. So Krishnaji was not impressed. And then Krishnaji said, but did you find something like this? He made a gesture like this. Maybe Krishnaji was asking, was he like Krishnamurti? So I said, sir, the only person who has really deeply affected my life is you. And then he smiled. But I feel that many people, not Krishnaji, is also has gone through this process and many things, and he doesn't like to talk about it. But other people have gone through such things, and they like Gopi Krishna wanted scientists to investigate this phenomena of Kundalini, because he felt that when this energy, which is at the base of the spine, when it goes to the brain gets affected, a kind of transformation happens. And then a person acquires a new way of looking, living. And that is what happened to him. But for 12 years, he suffered a lot, tremendous pain. And but after that, he began to get something. So what Krishnaji says, that it is very dangerous to talk about Kundalini, because people can go mad if, and also Gopi Krishna says that it is very dangerous when this energy goes through the wrong channel, then it creates kind of, people can go mad. So it is very dangerous. And Krishnaji also says, don't touch it. And so I think, and Gopi Krishna said that the sages of Upanishads, they had differences among them. And so, and Gopi Krishna said that Krishnamurti is very honest teacher, and he is not interested in publicity and propaganda and all that thing. So yes, there is a mystery. I don't think the scientists know what actually thinking is. And they say it is a process, material process in the brain. But I feel that this thinking is not just localized in the brain, and but it can travel like a wave, and our brain works like a transmitter and receiver, and that is how some people are able to communicate. with each other non-verbally. And this I speak from my personal experience that two people think about the same thing at the same time. And that is what Krishnaji wanted, that kind of listening. And he said, don't listen with thinking about something. You really listen so that we are at the same wave. That means getting exactly what Krishnamurti is saying and not thinking about it or agreeing with it or disagreeing with it. So, okay, I have said enough. Let Chhabra ji, thank you.
Chhabra ji.
See, we can also take up questions if you want, because I don't know how much time is also left, and
No,
there are also people who are.
I'm not
to
interested in
happen.
questions right now, sir. You please
Okay.
go.
Okay.
We are discussing it for 1 month. So
Okay.
questions come and go. So you please
Okay.
go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah. When Harshji and Harshad Parekh ji, I think have covered quite a field, and Harshji, I just towards the end when he was saying these are questions, and there's nothing one can really do anything about it, because if thought is not going to create insight, or insight is not something like love, not cultivable. So what is it? That means, is there anything in one's hand? I think the same question was there, and Upul Jaikar also seemed to come to that kind of understanding or conclusion that, well, that means there's nothing one can do about it. And then there is this, is it that nothing can be done? One can't do anything about it? Because there is this faculty of awareness, faculty of also observing. When we want to learn about anything, the first step is observation. But it goes very quickly into thinking. So but isn't observation that's a wider, larger, that can kind of look at the whole field to whatever extent. So that's, I was also, today this was going through my mind. I was thinking, weather was changing all the time. It was a lovely morning, but today the sun was a little weak because of a lot of clouds. In fact, a little while ago it rained a bit, didn't have the thunder and like in Dehradun, but it did drizzle. And I had this feeling that, see, what is the source? Always look at the source of everything. There is this sense of no center. You see, that intelligence also comes into being when there's no center. So there's no center as the source. That's the feeling one was getting. And is it possible to see what the center, we see that what the center does, or how dysfunctional it is. Like when this whole sense of I and me and having a certain function at one level, but how dysfunctional it is when it comes to relating to the world, relationship, where there's a certain flow is what you consciously, unconsciously demand, but bring in thought and image, and that makes it jerky, that makes it, breaks it. So that, I was just wondering whether this, is it possible for to connect to that source or allow that no center, the sense of no center to function in life? And so that's that's a it seems that seems to work sometimes. That seems to work, but but of course, since it's not cultivable, like I think we all go through that. We all have moments of deep sense of love for no reason, deep sense of gratitude. You don't know why, from where, gratitude to who is feeling grateful, what is this feeling? But the mind is probably finding only that word. It's just expressing it this way. But this just comes like a wave. You have not asked, you've not thought about it. But these waves come and go. And sometimes you are just wondering, looking at it, even maybe looking at it critically, even intellectually, and yet that wave is undisturbed, it's there. So is there, I think, if we ask ourselves, is it possible, is there a way of living in which the dysfunctionality of center is seen? And so whatever is whenever seen doesn't have a grip. Something happens. So, and also wonder whether one can, is the mind looking for any certitude, or whether it is it, what one would call it. So is that, when there is a very natural sense of joy, obviously there's no search for certitude. Mind is not looking for anything. So it's what is a state of mind which is not seeking any certitude? So it's very naturally observing, watching, and that watching and observing and listening seems to take care of whenever, wherever thought is used, is required. I'm just thinking aloud, what the what the mind observes and so is there because I think the moment mind is looking for any certitude, it's creating an illusion. That's a sense one gets. Whenever the mind is trying to define something and holding on to something, clinging to something, that's there's a sense of the usual ways of the self, usual ways of the mind, that has this tendency of holding on to something. And that's whatever one holds on to can be obviously questioned and destroyed in a way. So is it possible to have a mind that remains anchored in a flow or non-anchored? That's the question. And I think that's also that connects to that what I began with, the sense of no center. So it's not a sense of one knows there is this, which is just a sense that the feeling one gets. I'll just narrate something. It's even something another story. That's what brought me to Jalna, for instance. There, for the first time, way back in 2004 or 5, I had read this Fukuoka's book, One Straw Evolution. I think some of you might know. And he evolved this system of different farming, natural farming. It's slightly different from organic farming. It's natural farming. That means you intervene when it is absolutely required. Like the nature gives you a signal and you intervene. Otherwise, you don't. So it's a do-nothing farming. Now, this fellow, Fukuoka, was a scientist who used to study pathology of plants. And he used to work very hard. And in the night, sometimes till late, he was in the lab, came out, and he was tired and sat under a tree and probably dozed off. And very early morning, there was a flutter of a huge bird, and he woke up and had this deep sense of what you would call insight. Man knows nothing. And that's the beginning of his new way of farming. He said he couldn't go back to that job. And so he went to the woods and started growing rice and was able to give higher yield than any scientific field. And people wondered how come students would come from a scientific, from institutions. And usual ways, of course, you measure nitrogen, potassium, whatever the inputs you give. And here there was nothing of that kind. And still the yield was higher. So, and this was, he said, we all think in terms of doing something about it. This so-called action-oriented, whether it is action or reaction, that's another matter. But in that chain we remain, and we have this urge and almost compulsive, like compulsive thinking, also compulsive action, that we must do something about our goals or whatever. So here he said, what about not doing anything, doing nothing? So experiment with do nothing and observe nature, be with nature, observe nature, and listen to nature. And when there is that signal, that indication, that sense, okay, now I need to maybe do this, put the seed or make a ball around with the soil and just leave it there, So that's so people have probably in their different people have had insights in their own life and have operated from there, have experimented and lived from there. So, but how does one? Of course, this is probably a question of what is it that this? It's not cultivable, and yet what is it? There's no preparation. There's no path. There's no way, and yet. Is it that it is neither this way nor that way, neither through hard work nor through laziness? So it's a, or is it there's a deep observation not in order to achieve, in order to do something, in order to get something or get somewhere, but is it that a certain inquiry is there, certain inquiry and certain deep observation is there, and in that seed may sprout and flower. So that's again the mystery that Harshad Parekh also indicated. So I think now we can, there's there are some, I think, questions, so maybe
Yeah.
we can.
I think Vagmaraji's hand is up.
That's
Yeah.
enough. Yeah.
First of all, I am thankful and grateful to all the speakers for opening their hearts and speaking at length on the subject. I would like to ask Tankha sir that what exactly he was meaning by mutation. Was he indicating or hinting that there will be absence of fear or absence of totally violence or emotions and feeling, or there will be modified continuity? But elsewhere he has denied the modified continuity. So can we have some clarity on that?
From what I understand, the actual functioning of the brain is changed. That means the pathways that the brain would normally follow. Sometimes you have heard him say, are you in a rut? A rut, when wheels pass on the ground, they leave a rut. And then when another, you come across there, then your wheels tend to get stuck in the rut and go along in that path. Even when, in fact, it's quite difficult then to get the wheel out of the rut and go in a different direction. So I think my understanding is that his view of, firstly, that fear is conditioning. It's conditioning in the sense that at one path, I'm not putting any value judgment, I'm just talking about what conditioning is, that we've done the same thing again and again. I've come to a certain situation which is dangerous. So I have acted in a certain way to move away from the danger. Nothing wrong with that. But I've got into the habit of that. Let me say, I meet strangers and I find that strangers are, when I meet them, I have to be careful of them. So after a while, I begin to develop this conditioning that any stranger I meet, I'm suspicious of. So now I'm not looking afresh. This may not be a person I need to be suspicious of. My reaction to this person is being determined by my conditioning. My past experiences are conditioning my future experiences. So what I understand is the mutation is not like necessarily a change in the DNA of the cell or something like that, but this reliance on old pathways that are recorded in the brain, that when we understand the nature of the thing, we may still have pathways, but they lose their effect. And I think when he talks about freedom from the self, he doesn't mean that the self is completely eradicated or wiped out, like the memory is wiped out. That would be ridiculous. We wouldn't be able to function. But that our reliance on the old pathways, on the old way of doing things, we may still do it because it may be the right thing to do. But in each situation, we don't rely on that. The brain becomes alert to that process somehow. What actual physical changes take place? It may just be that the interconnections between the cells change, or the pathways in the cells change, or something like that occurs, so that our reliance. But this is my understanding, that there is actually a physical change.
Brain will not move in grooves. You mean to say what he said?
It won't move in the groove. It could still move in the groove if necessary, but it won't move in the groove. Necessarily move in the groove. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
I would say that it is not very important to gather this kind of information, but to really look at oneself. I think in that there is a direct way of learning, then gathering information, and then it may not change at all. If we can gather what David Bohm said or what Krishnaji said, and gather about what is inside, all that information may not create insight in our own life. So this is a more non-verbal thing which we can do, and maybe the starting point itself may be difficult because Krishnaji says freedom is at the beginning. The ability to be alone, then be very silent, then be very curious, then turning the attention inward. These things are, we are not taught that in the schools and colleges. We are just gathering information about the universe and then reproducing and writing books and all that. But it is always about the outside thing. So when a person, suppose, gets angry, then if he has a question, what is this anger? What is behind it? I want to really give my full attention to this phenomenon of anger. What is behind it? Why it comes? Is it really possible to be free? When such question and such attention comes, then also we can gather the information of the outside world. It's not difficult. Maybe it can become more efficient. So the real learning is learning about the self by the self. It means watching clearly what is happening within our mind.
No, I completely agree with you, Harshad ji, but I think there is a point when, and I think in these discussions with scientists, Krishna ji talks about that as well. Here I am, I've only just begun to see that the human mind is maybe a little, just a little bit. I've seen its condition, that I have fears, that I have all these things. They're getting in the way of living life, not just my life, but people in general. They are producing the world that I begin to see this. Yeah. At this moment, now, there's not great point in trying to imagine. People do some state in which I'm free of all of this. Yeah. Because that's not the reality. The focus, and I think this is what you're saying, our focus should be on what is. What is, not on what might be, what could be. Right. So, and what is that I am, this is almost a paradox. What is that I am trying to get somewhere, right? That's what is. So even this getting somewhere, or that I'm trying to operate with knowledge, that I want to find more and more about brain cells and how they work, right? That's not going to help, yeah? But I don't know this yet. But if I'm committed to the inquiry, discovering about myself, the functioning of thought, the functioning, and I push that to its end, then I begin to see what are the limitations. So this is thought discovering itself, not some extra kind of capacity to perceive that is looking at thought, but thought looking at itself is discovering. And this is, I think, for many people, when you describe your own experiences, you also talked about how you looked at how thought functions, and your experiences are very similar to mine, including I was present at that Lakshmi Shankar recital, and I remember this to this day. Absolutely magical, right? So I know what you're talking about. But once you start looking in whatever is happening with you at that point, whatever is the self for you, then it begins to lead you, say, to that concert where you sit and something else happens, right? It will take you somewhere, but not like a path, not like I practice this and I will get there, not some kind of, but your own intensity of looking, of observing, of inquiry, of discovering what is the self, not what might be some non-material process that some people have talked about.
Yeah, what I think also that intellectual clarity also purifies the mind.
Sir, time is over, sir. Time is over. So let us finish this meeting.
Yeah.
Parekh sir, time is over.
Yes, we can.
Right. So, Mr. Kamlesh, please close the meeting.
Thank you, sir.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
very much, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for giving
Yes.
the opportunity to talk about these things.
Thank you. Thank you very much
Thank
to
you,
every
everybody. Thank you, everybody.
and participant.